All right, we're live with the Landlord-Tenant Study Committee, and we are going to go right into public comment. But first, if we could just quickly do a round of introductions for folks watching. So Rep. Emily Krasnow and I serve South Burlington, Chittenden 9.
I'm Jean Murray. I'm an attorney at Vermont Legal Aid.
All right, and then online, Nora.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nora Aarons, she, her pronouns, and I am here today under CVOEO as the tenant representative for this committee. Hope everyone had a good weekend.
Thank you. And Angela.
Good morning, everyone. Angela Zakowski. I'm the director of the Vermont Landlords Association.
Senator.
I'm Rich Westman. I'm the senator from Lemoyne.
And Sean.
Good morning, folks. This is Sean Gilpin. I'm the director of the Housing Division at the Department of Housing and Community Development.
Awesome. Well, that's our committee for now. A couple folks will be joining us momentarily. So we'll go right into public comment. Megan, why don't you kick us off? Thank you so much. And you're on Zoom, so I assume you can see the timer in the corner. And yeah. Okay.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening today. My name is Megan Downey. I'm a renter in Winooski and a social worker in Burlington. So I've been a renter in Winooski for the past 8 years, and I lived in the same home for 7 of those years until my building was sold and the new landlord increased the rent immediately by 20%. My landlord's justification was that we'd been paying below market rate, but the reality was that my rental payment had gone from something I could afford to far outside of my means overnight, drastically impacting my financial security, mental health, and overall well-being. As I talked with my neighbors, it was clear that all of us were struggling to make ends meet in a system that favors the financial interests of wealthy homeowners over the safety and well-being of the rest of us. A neighbor who was a nurse at UVM Medical Center moved out of state as she could no longer afford to live here. My close friends in Winooski, a family of lifelong Vermonters, were evicted from their home without cause when their landlords decided that they wanted to start their own family in the apartment my friends had called home for a decade. They were given 3 months to move out, and after a fruitless search for affordable housing in Vermont, were forced to start over in another state where they could afford to live. My partner signed a lease for an apartment, but was contacted by the landlord a month before moving in and told that the landlord had changed his mind and would be living in the home instead. And as I walk to my office in downtown Burlington, I see how the crisis affects the most vulnerable within the system, leaving thousands of our neighbors without any shelter at all. This is a cruel and completely avoidable reality that demonstrates how far Vermont has fallen from its stated values of an inclusive safe haven for all. By implementing common sense policies to increase affordable options and develop systems of accountability for landlords, you have the opportunity to address and reverse this crisis. In communities across Vermont, your constituents have made it clear that we are united in our desire for change. Just cause eviction proposals passed in multiple towns. In Winooski, our charter change proposal passed by a nearly 3-to-1 margin. Yet this legislative body continues to stall progress on moving these initiatives forward, failing once again to uphold the democratic process and fulfill the will of the people. If you don't act immediately, your constituents will continue to fall ill, suffer, and even die due to being unsheltered or living in unsafe conditions. We will continue to lose the helpers in our community as nurses, educators, and social workers like myself are increasingly unable to make ends meet in Vermont. The reality is that when any of us are forced to endure inhumane living conditions, the health and safety of our entire community is degraded. I'm urging you to act now, not only on behalf of the most vulnerable, but on behalf of your own family, friends, and neighbors who deserve to live in a healthy and safe community. To begin to remedy this crisis, the following reasonable actions should be taken. Move forward just cause eviction legislation. Develop a rental registry to create a system of accountability for landlords. Develop and enforce weatherization requirements for homeowners. rent caps to ensure that large and unreasonable rent hikes no longer lead to de facto evictions. Housing is a human right. Your constituents are ringing the alarm that our current conditions are unsustainable and our state has reached a breaking point. Please do your part to take action so we can build a safer, healthier, and more equitable place for all of us to live. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next we have in real life, Joe Moore. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Moore. I live in Montpelier. I work for the teachers union, but I'm not here speaking on behalf of the teachers union. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I am fortunate enough to be a homeowner, but like many homeowners, I was a renter for many years, most of my adult life, in fact. During my 15 years or so as a tenant in multiple states, I've had many good landlords, a few not so good landlords, and some in between. I've experienced unreasonable rent hikes as high as 20% in 1 year, heating and plumbing issues that went unaddressed for far too long, and in one particular case, a brown recluse spider infestation, where my landlord refused to call an exterminator because she insisted that spraying vinegar around the property would do the trick, and it didn't work. So my experience as a renter makes me sensitive to the fact that the landlord-tenant relationship is one of unequal power. Decisions made by a landlord to renew a lease or not, to increase rent by 5, 10, 20%, to fix a pipe now or 6 months from now can have monumental consequences for a tenant and their family. And this power differential is compounded by the fact that Vermont has one of the lowest rental vacancy rates in the United States. Vermonters who lose access to housing have very few alternatives. Low vacancy also contributes to higher rents. According to the Vermont Housing Needs Assessment, between 2019 and 2024, average rents in Vermont have gone up 25 to 35%. More than half of Vermont tenants now pay in excess of 1/3 of their income in rent, classifying them as rent burdened. And 1/4 of Vermont tenants pay more than half of their income towards rent. That's an astonishing figure that speaks to the deep crisis of affordability that exists in this state. So this committee is charged with investigating existing landlord-tenant laws in Vermont in light of these trends and making recommendations to the legislature. So I would like to suggest 3 specific policy interventions to address Vermont's rental affordability crisis: rent control, just cause eviction, and the creation of a statewide rental registry. None of these policies is a panacea, but taken together would go a long way towards prioritizing safe, stable, and affordable housing for all Vermonters. Rent control is a critical policy tool to address the skyrocketing cost of rent. Many states and municipalities around the country have turned to some version of rent control as a way to alleviate the relentless cost pressures on tenants, while allowing landlords to respond to inflation and make necessary investments in their properties. In 2019, Oregon passed a bill to cap annual rent increases to 7% plus CPI for units 15 years and older. In 2020, California followed suit with a bill to cap rent increases for most tenants at 5% plus the rate of regional inflation. Several states in the United States, including my home state of New Jersey, allow municipalities to pass their own rent control regulations tailored to the needs of landlords and tenants in those communities. Vermont, as you know, is not one of those states, and we are falling behind other states that have been more forward-thinking and proactive in this area. Given the time, I'll just wrap up by saying Vermont tenants are experiencing a crisis of housing affordability. It's having significant adverse consequences for our state. Now is the time for policymakers to think broadly and act boldly to address this crisis. Vermont does not have to be leading the way. As I mentioned, many states have been doing these things, in some cases for decades, but we cannot allow ourselves to fall behind and wait too long to act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Thanks.
Dan. Hello, also in real life. Hello.
Hello. My name is Dan Blau. I'm from Burlington, Vermont, and I'm a pharmacy tech at the University of Vermont Medical Center. And these are obviously my own views. Thank you very much for having me today. I moved to Vermont from Boston in 2012. I was a renter in Chittenden County for about 8 years until my partner and I bought a home in the old north end of Burlington. We were privileged to have ended up in such a vibrant and diverse community We love our neighborhood and would feel very lucky if our first home ended up as our forever home. Our little street is made up of about 50% renters and about 50% owner-occupied homes, which is a little more ownership than the city at large. Unfortunately, Burlington has a vacancy rate of less than 1%, and about a third of renters spend more than 50% of their income on housing. This and the lack of available units, even above market rate, continues to shrink our middle class. It's not possible for most of our neighbors to save up and purchase a home in the community in which they live. This level of housing insecurity has no doubt contributed to the shocking increase in substance abuse and homelessness plaguing our beloved Queen City. These issues have been building for years, and it's now too late for small incremental change. We need radical solutions before we reach a breaking point. Vermonters deserve legislation that has been proven broadly popular, like just cause eviction protection and rental registries, but even that is not enough to reverse the trend. We also need caps on annual rental increase, right of first refusal, and broader support for tenant unions. This ultimately comes down to what kind of society we want to live in. We should agree to protect the many and stop privileging the few. Thank you all so much for your time and work.
Thank you so much. And our final public comment for this morning is Susan.
Hi, it's Susan Bowen, and I'm a landlord of Rosedale, and thank you all for your service as representatives and everybody here. And I hear I've also been a tenant, and I've had, I guess, good landlords, and I'm a really good landlord and I have good tenants, and I'm here because I think that the landlords who are good landlords and the good tenants shouldn't be paying for issues that the not so great landlords are causing in the state. Rent control, rental registries, all these things are kind of communistic, and they do not quite cover. They make broad strokes to cover everybody rather than just taking care of the few. That's why we have court systems and other things like that. And I know on my lease, I have a document that I say everything will be fixed within 14 days. That's the law. And we do it unless it's hard to get a contractor, then we do our best to do our fixes. And then we also say on our lease how much the rent is going to go up. And then we as landlords don't always have control of what taxes are going to go up as and what the all the other expenses, water and heat, and we try to make the best decisions, and I work with my tenants. I have not evicted anybody since 1999 when it was a drug addict school bus driver, and anyway, she shouldn't have been driving buses, kids. So I want to reiterate what I said last week is that I request that you look at your bills and make sure that good landlords and good tenants don't have to jump through hoops and pay more for things like rental registries. That sounds like it's a cheap fix to control all these landlords, but that $35, if it's 35 or 100 or 50, it gets transferred to the tenant. And maybe it's only $2 a month that the rent gets raised to pay for a rental registry, but that's $2 out of the tenant's pockets. And also, yeah, if anybody has any questions, they can contact me at 802-999-7757. I'm happy to show you my lease, and you can talk to all my tenants. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And again, for folks who testified, you're also welcome to submit your comments to the committee members, who may have not been here, and just to all of us, if you send them over to Mike, we can just distribute them. But thanks everyone, for your public comment. Okay, so now wanted to take some time, so on our agenda for the meeting today, we have, some national folks who are gonna talk about some of the policies that they're working on, in different states, and, that was something that, many of us had talked about would be helpful to see, obviously, for the legislators here, it's helpful to see what's being implemented in other states, and what's working, what's not. But as far as I'm concerned, I would like to still, obviously, our time, we're in such a time crunch, for the remainder of our task, and I was hoping I would talk to Terry, because I really, we need to have some folks from the judiciary, and I think to talk more about that process. Jean, we had talked about, you give a presentation kind of, but you are on the committee, so you know your voice is here too. I would like to hear more about that. What's your kind of, how are people feeling now that we've kind of delved a little deeper into our task before we have to really work on our report? Obviously, it's different. We don't have a bill in front of us to kind of splice up and discuss. So, but what are folks kind of feeling? Joe, did you want to pick us up?
Sure, I'll jump right in. I think a good point was made a little while ago that we need to just keep in the back of our minds as we think about fixes to a problem, is that any fix that costs money, landlord money, doesn't cost the landlord, it costs the tenant. So if we're, if you kind of think of it as, different piles to fix, the landlord side, the tenant side, and the cost. I mean, that's I think everyone's kind of bringing up the cost, which is a supply and demand problem, in my opinion. So, if you're solving this problem over here, but you're just making the cost problem worse by doing it, that's something we need to keep in mind.
I appreciate that. Anyone else would like to?
I mean, I'm excited to hear what some other states are doing. I know we're not alone in having a housing crisis. I know it's one of the worst in the country, but I certainly am really excited to hear what other people are doing, because I think it's important. We don't need to recreate the wheel. If there are things that are being done in other places that are working, I think that we can learn from those communities. But I certainly am really hearing the urgency and the scope of the problem. As a renter myself, I'm also someone who experiences some of these challenges. So I certainly am just really understanding that we need to work urgently. And again, happy to learn from some of the other places that have taken action already.
And as far as the urgency, what direction would that lead you to want to go?
I mean, I don't know that I have landed on, I know this, because I don't know all the solutions, which is again why I'm happy to hear but from other communities. But I am hopeful that by the end of our time together, we will have recommendations for legislation for the session.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I have ideas, but again, I don't.
Well, yeah, no, I appreciate that. It would be helpful if folks had ideas of again, we have what, 2 more meetings? 3? But we have one that's reserved for the report. So again, committee, if folks have ideas of people that they'd like to hear from, that could be helpful. that would be great. And I would love if people want to throw their direct policy ideas so that we can kind of get those in formation. That would also be helpful before we work on and agree to the report. So, but yes, Jean, did you have anything to add?
I guess I think about, in addition to thinking about the tenant side of things all the time, I also think about the low income tenant side of things and how not changing policy to make sure that low income people have an affordable place to live is actually expensive for the state of Vermont because there's programs, the Housing Opportunity Program that the legislature funds, and they will give out rent money to save tenancies, but only if the tenancy is sustainable, in other words, that it's affordable. So by not giving out money to save tenancies, that means that the tenants lose their housing and become homeless. And then the state pays way more money, even for a very short period of time, 84 days, but that's way more money than it would have taken to preserve the tenancy where they're at. So that policy, that circular policy of having low-income people go through the trauma of being evicted, homeless, have people working on finding them new homes is expensive and not logical to me. So I'd like to make sure that the committee doesn't lose sight of how state policy is affecting the state budget and the ways that money could be better spent.
Yeah. To your point, I think, even beyond just the 84 days in an emergency shelter, we're also talking about increased healthcare costs, increased, support costs. I mean, I wonder if JFO has any sense of what those costs are. I think a lot of times we can get really focused on what the cost of doing something is, but we forget to look at what the cost of doing nothing is.
Inaction.
Exactly.
Yep, that's true. And cost benefit, as Rep. Parsons pointed out. But yeah, inaction can also be quite expensive. Any folks online, Senator Westman or Angela? Nora, we have Sean, anyone kind of want to weigh in on the direction and what else we need to do, hear from?
I mean, I think I will just say or point out to the committee that the housing provider community is an easy one to sort of point the finger at here. It's their fault. They're the ones raising the rent. They're the ones doing this. Generally, rent gets raised because landlord expenses have gone up, right? We have a very well documented huge property tax increase around the state this year. That translates into increased rents for tenants. New regulations, new requirements, all place burdens on this structure. We know we have underdeveloped housing units for a considerable length of time. We have a supply issue. We're in the process of fixing that, but it's coming at the end. And I think it's incredibly unfair if we're looking at sort of a global situation, which has been created by underdevelopment of units, perhaps wage issues, the way we provide services to folks, as Jean Murray pointed out, how we pay for rental assistance or rent arrearage programs, to then sort of put all of that, which is a collective problem, and place it over onto the landlord and just say, it's their fault. We should put more restrictions on them. So I think, this is a bigger problem than just landlord needs to be punished, which is kind of what this starts to sound like, with the public comments that I'm hearing and sort of the look at this. And really, they're one piece of this puzzle and one aspect of it. And this is not something necessarily that they have created, a system that they have created. They have worked within the system that was presented to them. So I think, again, just being mindful, I think Senator Parsons pointed it out as well. If we are passing costs along, that's also going to impact renters. So that's my 2 cents.
No, I appreciate that. And again, public comment is open to all, and I'm trying to do outreach to different organizations as much as I can so that we have a balanced comment, but that is public comment also reflects, how folks are feeling, and but I appreciate that. It's my intention that we do have balanced conversations and that all the perspectives are heard. So I'm happy to talk more about that as well. Senator Westman, did you have anything that you'd like to add as we're
Well,
having a discussion?
let me start by saying that I do have 11 apartment units in one complex. And it resonates with me because of that. Taxes have gone up. Most insurance companies across the country have gone, in the last 3 years, have forced landlords to buy insurance that is replacement costs, which is driven in with all of the increases through COVID in the cost of building materials and everything, drove insurance costs up dramatically. Also, there are 2 areas that I think I'm not going to talk about no cause eviction, but when you have for cause eviction and you have tenants that are dramatically behind, when one doesn't pay, the others have to pick it all up. And when you have a process in for cause eviction that takes months and months to get through, it drives the cost up for everybody. The other area that I would say, and I've heard no one in the tenant community bring this up in any of our hearings, in any of this, is the renter rebate program has dramatically fallen behind every other program in the state, and no one speaks about it. And the younger tenants that I have with young families don't meet any of the categories for renter rebate anymore. And that directly falls upon the legislature and the people in the legislature that don't speak up for lower income tenants. And that program is been dramatically left behind. And I see it all the time in my tenants that used to be eligible and aren't anymore. So I would think that at some point we should talk about what the parameters of renter rebate is.
No, that's really helpful, and I serve on the committee on housing, so that's definitely thanks for raising that. And
we haven't talked about it at all in any of our conversations here yet.
yeah, no, I'm taking notes and I put a star next to it. Thank you. That's really important. While you have the floor still, are there any other voices that you think would be helpful for the next upcoming meetings that you would like to? So today we have kind of other states, what they're doing, what's working, what's not working. Do you have any suggestion further if there's anything you'd like to?
I would say I think that none of us around this table, or most of us around the table, not I think the parameters around renters rebate and getting someone in from the tax department and in the state to talk about that program, because that program has woefully been left behind. And what's happening in renters rebate, how many people, what's the background of all of that, we ought to talk about. Because if you're going to help lower income families that are lower income, the parameters around renters rebate haven't gone up for to follow the increases in cost at all. So we ought to dive into that, and we ought to really understand not from one side or the other, but what are the facts around for cause eviction? What times does it take? What's the process?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. I agree, and we'll make sure that we get those in. I wrote that down, and we'll reach out to the appropriate people to get the information. That was really helpful. Thank you. Anyone else online? Sean, Nora, did you want to weigh in? Anything spurring your attention?
First off, apologies. I dropped off for a minute there and missed a couple comments. In their infinite wisdom, IT decided 8:25 in the morning was a good time to force a reset on the computers. I don't have anything to add right now. I think I would reiterate, I mean, I agree everything that's brought up. There's definitely rich topics to dive into, but I don't have anything in addition right now.
Thank you. Okay, yes.
I do, well, I certainly appreciate that we need to address the challenges for low-income renters. I do want to just sort of frame that the scope of the problem has become so big that it isn't only impacting low-income Vermonters. There are plenty of Vermonters who on paper are making good salaries that cannot afford to live here, that cannot afford the rent. And so I think there is certainly the issue of our lower income Vermonters, but I think when we frame it only in that way, we are missing our whole middle class and our whole group of people who, like one of our committee members has said on a few occasions, I make a good salary, can't afford to live here. So I think that we have to really look at the scope of the problem as broader. And there may be different issues when we're talking about our lower income renters. But it's become such a huge issue that that's not the only population it's impacting. I think it's really impacting most, if not all, renters. And it's impacting the trajectory forward to being able to be successful and sustainable here. One of our public, people who gave public comment really pointed to the fact that because of the scope of this issue, people aren't able to buy homes here. They're not able to settle here. They're not able to have families here, which is adding to our demographic challenges. So I do think that the scope has moved far beyond only impacting our low-income Vermonters.
I wouldn't disagree. I just wanted to make sure
Yes.
low-income Vermonters are still on the table to talk about.
No, of course, and absolutely, I agree. And obviously, the legislators here, as we knock doors, in our communities, I have a large portion of renters in my district, and many of them were not there this time because they were pushed out for various reasons, and were not happy to leave their communities, and that was a really hard reality. Obviously, we've talked about the perfect storm of factors. Angela brought that up as well. There's a lot of, this is as if things weren't hard. There has been a lot in the last year or so that have really contributed, obviously after the pandemic, but then also, between property tax increases and cost of living and other things. It's just been a really hard time for many, and but absolutely. It's also my intention that I believe that there are things that we can do not only to support and look to how we can help renters, but I think that we haven't had many I worked in the building for 8 years before I was a legislator, but Rep. Parsons and I serve on the housing committee, and we didn't have the capacity during the session to really dive into as much as I requested around also just hearing, landlords' perspective too. And I think that there are policies that can really help both. And I'm hoping that we can come together as a committee and people that, we can make sure that our, report and recommendations reflect, some policy recommendations that can support, I don't want to put it as sides, but to make it so that, both voices, had their representation and perspective, put into the report, as well. So that's the intention that I would like, to show that we're not gonna just focus on one thing or the other. What do folks think about that?
Yeah, no, there's certainly a completely different element of emotion involved when you talk about rental housing as opposed to renting a car or going down to the local tool place and renting a piece of equipment. We treat them completely differently because it is somebody's home. But it is also also an agreement between two people. One has something the other would like, and when you take the emotion out of it, it's a pretty simple process, but that is there nonetheless, so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that was just something that was pointed out to me while I was talking with people about when the committee started, just chatting with renters and landlords and stuff. It's a pretty bare bones, simple thing. It's, I have a home, you want a home, let's have a lease agreement.
I keep thinking of things that we are talking about as if we all know what they are. We talk about lease agreements, and I testified in front of House Judiciary once about, I guess they were talking about reciprocal attorney's fees and the lease agreement. And I was surprised to discover that a lot of people think there are standard things in leases, and leases mean the same thing each time. Not in Vermont, they don't. People use the word lease. It doesn't guarantee a certain amount of time. It doesn't guarantee any sort of, there's no standard form. There's no legal concept of a lease meaning the same thing from landlord to landlord. That's one of the things we talk about. We also talk about the amount of time it takes to evict a tenant, as if we know. And I don't want to talk about this too much without Terry being here from the judiciary perspective, but from the things that I've looked at, how long it takes to evict a tenant has a whole lot to do with the plaintiff's choices about how to approach the litigation, and also about what county you're in, because some of the judiciary resources are fairly spread thin in the very rural counties, and sometimes it can take a long time. So those kind of things that we're talking around, like how long does it take, and is this too long? And I firmly believe that it is because it is a person's home, that we're using a part of government to deprive them of their home, that they're entitled to due process of law. So every time somebody talks about this is taking too long, they're talking about truncating what has been due process. And I, for one, don't think that that should be, I can't even think of a place where it should be shortened. I guess on the books right now, there is a shortened period of time if the thing that the tenant is doing is affecting the health and safety of other tenants. And it has been suggested that where people are using drugs or under the influence of drug dealers who are using the property and all that other stuff. And I really wish there was a solution for that. And I just wouldn't want that solution to be one that only landlords can take, because landlords are not in a good position to have evidence of those things. They often don't live on the property. They don't have firsthand knowledge of what's going on. And people are losing their homes based on, I don't like the way you look or the way you act or how late you stay up at night. Although I gotta say, for cause eviction for those reasons that the tenant is behaving badly is less than 10%. It's somewhere between 7 and 10% of all evictions. So it's not the biggest part of the problem. The timeframes need to be shortened to get out the dangerous tenants. So I think we should talk about, well, before we start talking about assuming that eviction takes too long, I think we should really delve into how long does eviction take and why does it take that long? Because I think it needs to take as long as it does in order to ensure due process and to not set tenants apart as a different category of people who are brought to court. Like a big corporation that is leaking oil into the ground, their case can take 2 or 3 years. But a tenant, oh my gosh, they
Right.
gotta go now.
Thank you. Nora, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank everyone who has shared their thoughts and perspectives so far. I appreciate hearing everyone's thoughts on this very important issue. I just wanted to reiterate the point that Jean made. I've had leases that are 3 pages long, and I've had leases that are 30 pages long. So there really is no standard for what a lease looks like, at least in my experience. Also, while I appreciate the comments that have been made on how massive and unwieldy this issue can feel, I just want to be mindful and reiterate that I do feel we have reached crisis level as a state community, and I don't want the unwieldiness, so to speak, to end up leaving us as not taking action. Just to reiterate the point of the cost of inaction is often far greater than the cost of any attempt at change. Thank you.
One of the things that was really highlighted for me as Jean was sort of laying some of the points out around due process and the courts is the power differential between someone who needs a home yet can't afford to buy it and how much less, how many fewer rights they really have. Because if I owned my home and was doing drugs in my home, I wouldn't lose my home. But because I can't afford to own my home, I have to change my behavior and think differently. And the very least I should have in that is due process. So I think we also have to think about the inherent power dynamic between and how we're setting up different classes of people based on their ability to purchase a home or not, if we're not protecting those basic rights. I also think it's really important to recognize the inherent difference between a home and, say, a car or a piece of equipment. You know, if I don't rent a car, I'm not going to freeze to death at night. Like, a home is a basic human right. We can't ask people to really engage in our society. I've heard from people who have been pushed out onto the streets because of the end of the emergency motel program who can't get jobs because they don't have a permanent address. They can't, like, you can't do anything if you don't have a home. So I think there is, while the legal aspect of having a lease, it sounds like actually isn't that simple. I think you can look at it as, oh, it's just renting something, but I think the impact of a home is very different than most other things you might choose to rent.
Yeah, and we know, in Vermont, like, we've talked about this in our committee that, leases do look very different. Sometimes it's just a handshake,
Sure. I don't want to monopolize time or anything, but there's this other thing about people viewing tenancy as a temporary situation. Tenancy is a completely viable, legitimate thing that you can do forever. Like the place I live, I've been renting in January for 20 years. It happened, like people who don't necessarily want to do lawn work or whatever, it's a viable thing. And it's not temporary. It's not illegitimate. It's not unfortunate. It is a choice, and it should be a fair choice. And it is about a home is what you're renting. And so I don't know, it's sometimes a management agent was talking in House Judiciary, and I talked to her later, and as a manager, she thinks apartments should turn over every 5 or 6 years. And I'm thinking, well, why would you think that? It's not a temporary, unfortunate state. It is a percentage of Vermonters. And they told us last time, there's like 230,000 households that are owners and 76,000 households that are renters. It is a significant percentage of who Vermonters are that are renting, and it's not a temporary or unfortunate.
Thank
state.
you. Yes, oh, sorry, Nora?
Just to build off of that, I wanted to share my personal experience. So I am currently, or come springtime, when my current lease ends in May, I will be going through my 4th no cause termination or eviction because my landlord, property management company, even though I wanted to renew the lease and let them know that as early as September, because I am the only one out of the current tenants who wanted to renew, I am being kicked out, basically, because the apartment has not been turned over, so to speak, since 2021, and none of those original tenants are still in the apartment. So I am floundering and going through the hassle of looking for housing yet again, just because I have only lived here since June and my landlord wants to, quote, turn the apartment over since it has not occurred in only 3 years.
Thank you. Angela?
Thank you. I just wanted to weigh in and I'll try not to get off into the weeds too much on sort of the eviction process and what that looks like, because I think Jean and I could probably do a hour or two seminar on what that entails and involves. I found it interesting that her statistic was approximately 10% of evictions in the state of Vermont use that what we would refer to as a breach notice. So it's a 14, 15 or 30-day termination notice, depending on what the issue is. And I think the challenge that landlords run into with that type of notice specifically, and I think, this would come into play with any sort of just cause framework or anything along those lines, is that those types of notices require other tenants to participate in the process. So I think, as Jean noted, many times a landlord doesn't live on premises, isn't the person with the information about whatever the violations are that are happening at the property. And so we see a huge reluctance on the part of other residents in the building to get involved. They'll make complaints, but they don't want their names involved. They don't want to testify in court. They don't want to sort of pop their head above the fence. They're scared. Many times they're worried about retaliation from the resident that they're complaining about. And so what I see regularly is landlords using that no cause notice in those situations, because with a no cause notice, the only participation that's required is that of the landlord. So it doesn't involve the other residents in the building. It doesn't require that they be named in a termination notice. It doesn't require that they come to court to testify against their neighbor. It doesn't require that they live next door to that neighbor who now knows that those are the people that complained and reported their behavior to the landlord. So we spend a lot of time talking about this landlord-tenant relationship, and when it disintegrates, there's a whole other host of folks that live in these buildings that have to live next to units sometimes when they're causing problems, and they have to live there for months on end while the landlord's going through the eviction process, even if they're not using a breach notice. And it can cause a lot of chaos in a building for those other residents who have to live in that situation. And those residents haven't done anything wrong other than maybe having a bad neighbor. So I think that's one of the challenges, you know, when we see those low numbers with why our breach notice is not used a huge amount, that's part of the reason. Because you got to prove it, and to prove it, you usually need other residents in the building to participate in that process.
Thank you. All right, well, right on time for our next, let's put a pin in this, but, great conversations, helpful. I have some charges to get some different folks that I feel like, were recommended, out of, this discussion, and, appreciate the dialogue. All right, well, it is 9. I'm staying right on schedule. So next we have Trom, who's gonna come on, and thank you for joining us. We have the beauty of Zoom, so we can hear from folks. And yeah, so I know for me, it is helpful, and I know other legislators, to hear other perspectives of things that folks are working on. Yeah, so love to hear from you. Thank you for joining us here in Vermont today.
Thanks so much for having me. Good morning, everyone. My name's Trom Huang. I'm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm a senior associate on the Policy Link housing team. If you all have not heard of Policy Link, we're based in Oakland. We're a national organization. Let me pause for a quick second to share my screen since I have some slides to share with you all.
Great. I believe you're a co-host, so should be able to do that.
Let me know.
There
Okay,
it
you can
is.
see that?
We
Great.
see it. Thank you. I'll be squinting because I didn't bring, oh, there we go. Perfect.
Okay, hopefully that's better. I'll also email the slides so that you
Great.
will have access to them later.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right, so I can go through the slides. I don't think I'll take up my whole time, and so we can dive into Q&A afterwards. So please keep track of any questions you all have, and I'm happy to, I think all of the panelists are happy to answer later. So like I mentioned, PolicyLink is a national research and action institute. Our work focuses on advancing racial and economic justice. We've been around for a little over 20 years, and we work very frequently with federal, state, and local government partners, as well as nonprofits, to advance our work, which is to conduct research and support policy that improves the lives of the 100 million Americans living in poverty. I'm on the housing team, like I mentioned, but we also have folks working across many issues, including transportation, infrastructure, and climate resilience. And our team's work on housing generally focuses on fair housing and closing disparities and inequities across homeownership and rental housing. So at PolicyLink, a large part of our work is studying and helping jurisdictions enact and implement tenant protections. And I'll just kind of frame a little bit of the key reasons why we focus on tenant protections. So first is that tenant protections promote fair housing. I think, I've been listening into the conversation you've all been having, and I think this relates in many ways. We want to undo spatial patterns of social inequities, segregation, and disinvestment so that all people, regardless of race, gender, class, religion, other identities, have true housing choice and are able to live in healthy and thriving communities without fear of discrimination or retaliation. Next, we think that tenant protections are key to preventing displacement, specifically the forced displacement of low-income people and people of color from their homes and neighborhoods. But as we know, the housing crisis is impacting not just low-income folks, but everyone living in the United States. So it's important to prevent the displacement of those folks. Third, we see tenant protections as one pathway to slow down the concentration of power and ownership of housing by corporate and private equity funded landlords. I know that your members of Congress have proposed legislation to limit the role of price fixing algorithms, and I think that's a huge part of it as well. And we want to start shifting ownership to community or public actors who will treat housing as a public good rather than as an investment asset. And then lastly, we see tenant protections as a way to regulate the market because we don't see the housing system as one with good or bad landlords or good or bad tenants, right? That sets us up poorly to see tenants as deserving or undeserving. So in our belief, we have a housing market with regulated or unregulated actors. And as with any industry, we need regulations to protect consumers of housing, whether they are tenants or homeowners, which I refer to as bank tenants. And in our work across the country, we see states and cities and counties passing a really wide variety of policies to address the affordable housing crisis. And I'll go over a few of them. Since I won't be able to cover every possible policy, I encourage you all to look at the National Tenant Bill of Rights that's been published by the National Housing Law Project and the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. I'll include a link to it in my presentation, which I'll be sharing. So the first thing I want to touch on is rental registries. One of the biggest barriers to developing effective and targeted policies, housing policies, is that jurisdictions simply don't know enough about their housing market. Aside from having, a good sense of the neighborhood or just like, oh, I know from living here that these conditions exist. Many places do not have data or up-to-date data on who owns housing, housing conditions, affordable housing that's at risk of getting flipped, or tax credit buildings that have expiring affordability. We don't often find out until crisis hits, and then by then it's a little bit too late to act. So rental registries are a way to gather that data so that jurisdictions can respond to housing inequities that are specific to their local context. A good example of this, so there are rental registries in dozens of cities across the United States, but a good example is the city of Concord, California, who they passed a residential rental registry program, and it gave them the information they needed to craft tenant protections, I think with a 1 or 2 year gap. They were able to figure out what was going on in their housing market and protect residents from housing insecurity. And
oh, sorry to interrupt, and I know you said to save questions for the end. So just quickly, these 5 listed are, and we talk about rental registries in our committee as we have that bill that comes through it, and we did pass it through our committee. Those are these 5 are what, the only ones, or?
No, these are just
You just listed.
Yeah, I just listed, sorry, I should have said jurisdictions with rental registries include, but there are dozens more across the country.
Right, that's what I thought. That's why I was confused. Okay, so these are just 5 that have them.
Yes, these are just 5 examples that we at PolicyLink have looked into very closely, just to get a sense of, what is their registration process. And yeah, thank you for that. I should make an edit in the slide.
No, that's okay. All right. No, I was just confused because I was like, wait a minute, we've worked on this and that doesn't seem right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. No, thank you for flagging that. So you all, since you've considered it in the legislature, understand, right, that the type of information landlords can provide in these rental registries and that cities can require vary from owner information, number of units owned, occupation status, eviction filings, rental rates, any of that. I think our other speakers will touch on this, but it's very important also to require data on beneficial owners, who are the individuals who benefit directly from an LLC, just to get a better sense of transparency and how LLCs may be related to one another as we look at who owns housing in our communities. The last thing I'll say about rental registries is that they can also be leveraged to regulate the rental market. For example, a landlord, if we are also tracking code enforcement and code violations, that is one way that we can kind of leverage a rental registry to say, hey, for example, let's hold off on getting you a new rental license and expanding your stock if you have unaddressed code violations or have other kind of alarming or elements of property management that the city or state want to look into. So next, I will talk about tenant or community opportunity to purchase, sometimes they're referred to as TOPA or COPA. This is another emerging and effective set of policies that are commonly used to prevent displacement and encourage ownership. And these policies require property owners to provide an advance notice of sale to tenants. So essentially, you know, if I own a building and I'm about to sell, I give the tenants a heads up of, hey, in 60 days, I'm about to put this property on the market. It also creates timelines for tenants to form tenant associations, express interest in purchasing the unit, secure financing, and then tenants pay market value for the property that they've been living in if they are interested in and are able to put together the financing. And TOPA is becoming more popular as community ownership tool to both take back ownership from extractive financial actors, but also build community wealth through common land ownership. And a good example of that is in DC, where TOPA has been used to develop or preserve over 16,000 units of housing. A related policy is community opportunity to purchase. That gives nonprofit partners a chance to purchase property. And this helps to preserve affordable housing in the market. So a good example of that is in San Francisco, where COPA has been paired with a local preservation financing tool that they have. And it's focused on small buildings, so their small site acquisition program to target buildings in which tenants are most at risk of displacement. And that's been used for only a few years in San Francisco, but they've been able to preserve over 230 units, both by nonprofit developers and land trusts as well. And then from this map here, which we have on our website, you can see all the places that have already implemented or are considering tenant and community ownership policies. So I heard, oh, sorry, is there?
No, I was just reading.
Yeah, sorry, I know you can't see this super well, but promise to share a link to it. And I heard you all talking a little bit about eviction, so I think this is relevant as well. Next, we have tenant right to counsel programs, which guarantee that renters who are facing eviction have legal representation in eviction court. And for most renters facing eviction, having the right to counsel can mean the difference between staying in their homes and being forced out. These programs were originally started to address the power imbalance between property owners and renters, because while 81% of landlords have legal representation in eviction cases, only 3% of tenants do. So it is simply a way to guarantee that both parties, as we talk about due process, right, both parties have legal representation and are able to understand what is happening in eviction court. And as right to counsel has been implemented across the country, the results have shown them to be very effective, not just in reducing the number of households that are displaced, but also in saving jurisdictions tens of millions of dollars in other costs related to homelessness, shelter services, other social services related to housing insecurity. And as of 2023, we have seen 17 cities, 1 county, and 4 states pass and implement right to counsel with more on the way. And in the slides link, I also have some information from the National Coalition for Right to Counsel, which lists all of those ordinances and programs. And then we also have rent control, or rent stabilization, which has been considered at every level of government, most recently by President Biden, to protect renters from predatory and egregious rent hikes that are both reducing our affordable housing supply and increasing homelessness across the country. And these policies, as you know, create a predictable schedule for the maximum allowable rent while also ensuring a fair return for landlords. And contrary to theories or predictions, these policies are empirically proven to increase housing stability and affordability for tenants, also providing tenants with the leverage to attain improved housing conditions without fear of economic displacement as a form of retaliation. and also do not decrease housing production. So over 190 jurisdictions have enacted some form of rent control in the United States, with more passing it every year. And I think it's important to note that every ordinance includes provisions that entitle a landlord to a fair return on their investment. So as we consider, rising property taxes, rising insurance costs with our climate crisis, this means that every ordinance has a mechanism through which property owners can apply for exceptions to caps to get their fair return. And the benefits of rent control reach far beyond housing stability. For example, if rent burden was eliminated in the state of Vermont, which means that renters only pay 30% of their income on housing costs, the economy would have gained over $200 million in disposable income. I think that's really important to name, right? The economic impact of housing stability is enormous, and this is money in people's pockets to spend on healthcare, education, and just in general, more money in the local economy. And then finally, as you all have discussed, right, we have just cause, or referred to differently in other jurisdictions, good cause. And these ordinances are an important tool for municipalities to have at their disposal to prevent displacement and promote tenant stability, especially in tight markets or neighborhoods where rents are rising, vacancies are low, and in general, there is, property owners may be seeking to remove existing tenants to attract wealthier renters at higher prices. And Just Cause also protects tenants who report inadequate housing conditions or request repairs, which we know is huge as we have very much an aging housing stock. It makes it less risky to exercise their right to livable conditions. And this is really important to name because in the US Census Bureau's most recent household pulse survey, in September, we found that 52% of Vermont renter households felt significantly pressured to leave their homes. Of that 52%, 32% moved. And this is especially alarming because 14% of those who moved did so because their landlord refused to make repairs. So repairs and eviction threats are two key problems that Just Cause can directly impact and improve. Eliminating that fear of tenant retaliation gives tenants confidence in enforcing their right to habitable living conditions. And it also doesn't change the eviction process itself, right? It changes the reasons for which a tenant may be evicted, but generally, as folks have discussed, changes to the eviction process in jurisdictions or the eviction timeline take place under the umbrella of eviction reform, which is very much related to the court system and requires a lot of partnership with our court partners to examine and reform. And lastly, so researchers at UC Berkeley did some studies on the housing market specifically to address economists' fears of effects of tenant protections on housing production, because that I think is a common fear that has emerged. And researchers at Berkeley found that, for example, between 2007 and 2013, the 6 cities in the Bay Area that had the strongest tenant protections, which means in their case, rent control and Just Cause, actually produced more housing units per capita than cities without them. So, this is not to say that tenant protections create housing, right? But more so that the lack of tenant protections does not guarantee that more housing will be built. We know that we also need to take we need to take the route of production. Cities and states must be making land available for development and investing in the production of housing, especially affordable housing. And I think this last bit of research from Berkeley is really important to ground us in the reality that there are, as folks had mentioned, larger economic and global forces impacting housing supply, right? When we think about the last 5 years, even in a global pandemic, economic recession, rising interest rates, global supply chain interruptions, and labor shortages, we've actually still managed to see historic rates of housing construction. So in this graph here from the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, you can see the purple line up here shows single-family housing construction. The orange line below here shows multifamily housing construction, and we actually experienced a peak in construction in 2023, during which over 1 million multifamily units were completed. I also refer us to some industry surveys that were conducted and published by groups like the National Multifamily Housing Council and the Home Builders Association, which surveyed developers and industry folks and found that the factors developers reported impacting their work the most were, they weren't local tenant protections, right? But rather economic uncertainty, the availability of construction financing, economic feasibility, things like that. And in February, the National Association of Home Builders named tight lending conditions, the high cost of development loans, and a shortage of skilled labor as major headwinds in the multifamily market. So all that to say, local and state governments can and should be playing a role in building housing, despite the boom and bust cycle that we are kind of caught in, right? And adding to critical housing supply, regardless of when the private sector is producing. And this will be especially true in the coming years, as Fannie Mae is expecting subdued volumes of loans originated for multifamily housing in 2024 and continued softness in the market. So as we experience the drop in production after this kind of peak we experienced in 2023, we'll see a tighter housing market. And I think it's really important to name that in these tight conditions, it's even more important to have tenant protections in place. So I'll end there, and I'm not sure if folks have any questions or want to kick it over to other speakers, but I will, in the meantime, share these slides via email with you all.
Great, thank you, and we can post them on our webpage. In your experience, so here in Vermont, we have some municipalities who are kind of, can you talk quickly? I know we have some other questions but my question, and we talked about this in our committee upstairs, but I wanted to be part of this conversation as well. But so different municipalities, so where I represent, we have a rental registry, Burlington next door to me also, and then also, had a charter change for just cause eviction. But can you talk about, in your experience, talking with other folks across, the value or your opinion on why or why not it's important, if you feel that way, for us to do something on a state level versus municipalities deciding locally what's best for them? Does that make sense?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I think it is important to implement tenant protections in general at a larger scale. We know that people don't exist in one city, right? For example, I live in the Twin Cities. There are many people who move and live, work, play in between multiple cities, right? Whether that's Minneapolis, St. Paul, or the suburbs. And in that sense, it's really important to keep these protections uniform, in that, whether someone lives in Minneapolis or St. Paul, they deserve the right to due process in the eviction process, right? I think that's why we've seen more states pass just cause. So I have a chart that I'll share via email, but New Jersey, New Hampshire, California, Oregon had statewide just cause, and more recently we've seen Washington, Colorado, and New York pass it as well. So I think we're, in addition to the cities that have it, we're seeing states recognize the value of kind of reducing the burden on cities which manage many other parts of our housing system, and take it on the state level to play their role, right? We all have a role at county, city, state, federal level to contribute, and just cause is one of these things that can be done at the state level.
Thank you. And before we go to Angela, I have one more quick question. Who pays for the legal counsel for the tenants?
Yeah, varies by jurisdiction.
Okay.
And there were some places that used ARPA funding to launch their programs as kind of
Yep.
proof of concept, and then are now putting it into the budget. Generally, it is like public funding that is then routed to like a legal aid or legal services, but it does vary by jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Angela.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions about the delays in construction slide that you posted up. You had 4 or 5 different items on there that were indicating that those were the reasons for the delays in construction in these jurisdictions. I note 2 of those are economic feasibility and construction financing. You know, economic feasibility being, if this property is built, will it be able to pay for itself with rent? So one would question that if there were rent controls in place, that would be an economic feasibility marker or something that folks would be looking at. Same with construction financing. Banks look at return on investment. They look at, is this loan, if we make it, going to be paid back? And so they're looking at economic factors. One of those I would presume would be rent control. Do you have any comments or feedback about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a good opportunity for me to add another resource to the slides, which is a great study that was done by the University of Minnesota looking at essentially they modeled various rent caps to look at how certain rent caps impacted measures of return on real estate, right? Those were internal rate of return, return on investment, cash on cash return, various measures that, you know, go into a real estate pro forma. And what they found is that the most generous caps, if we had looked at, if, for example, looking back in time, if the most generous rent caps had been implemented in the housing market, it would have actually, and landlords actually increased rent at those maximum rent caps, it would actually produce a higher return on investment than folks generally expect and that were collected. And then when we had like medium rent caps, the rates of return were actually quite similar to what folks expect and what folks were seeing. And so that's a really great example of how, you know, as we are looking at returns and economic feasibility, we're seeing in these scenarios that are being modeled and across markets that the level of return that rent caps allow are very much in line with what folks are expecting on the investor end and what folks are lending already, lending money for developments that make that much return, which is, I think, a great sign of economic feasibility. And I think economic feasibility, a big part of that right now is just looking at the fact that with interest rates being so high, there are other financial assets and other investment tools that are actually making a much higher return than real estate. And it's really difficult for developers. You know, I know we see it in the Twin Cities and across the country. It's difficult for them to find investors because investors are saying, well, if I can invest in a T-bond that will give me a higher rate of return, then why would I, you know, why would I invest money in this development with such high interest rates being seen in the market? So I think those are a few things that I would add to the context of that slide.
I just have one more follow-up question. Minneapolis, St. Paul introduced rent control in 2022, correct? Does that sound right?
Yes, St. Paul did.
Okay,
Minneapolis
St. Paul.
did not.
Okay, right. Sorry, I forget they're actually 2 separate two separate cities. So St. Paul introduced in 2022, and they're, at least with some of the statistics I have seen, were roughly an 80% reduction in multifamily building permits within 3 months after that went into effect. Have you seen that data?
Yeah. So
Okay.
I, you know, I live in the Twin Cities, we've seen that data. I think there were a few, well, there was a bit of a capital strike that took place, right? Because in St. Paul, voters passed the rent stabilization ordinance, and our city council within a year had the power to amend the ordinance. And so the the 3-month window of kind of drops in development permits to us was a sign of folks kind of wielding their market power and saying, unless city council changes this ordinance, we are going to stop building. And we have kind of seen that reverse. I think we have seen permits pick up again. And then there's also really important comparison data in Minneapolis, which shows also a huge drop in approved projects in 2023. And as we mentioned, Minneapolis does not have rent stabilization. So there's a lot of timing in that data that we should be considerate of, especially when we look at the drops in construction in cities that had rent stabilization and cities that did not have it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow, we're really sticking to our time today perfectly. We really appreciate, oh, did anyone have a?
I actually do.
Oh,
You
shoot.
can't see me because
I
I'm sitting in
can't.
your periphery.
I know, you know what? All right, Senator Bihowski, take it away.
So I just wanted to go back to the rental registry. You said there's dozens of municipalities. Are there any states that have done this at the state level or are in process of doing this at the state level?
Great question. And Sam, feel free to chime in. I don't believe there is a state one yet. I know there are states that have considered it, and then there's also there will be a bill introduced in Congress in the coming months around a federal rental registry as well. So it's picking up interest, but I do not think there's a state level one yet.
That's helpful, thanks. I think about like all of our small municipalities and the burden, because you asked the question around the benefits of state level versus municipal level. And I certainly think about the burden of trying to run 242 different registries as opposed to just utilizing the economy of scale at the state level. I certainly know I hear from communities in my district that are considering this or have this and just think about all of the different things our cities are trying to do. I also think just the data at the state level is more helpful because we know there's a housing crisis across the state, not just in certain municipalities.
Yeah, no, I personally absolutely support that and have voted for it. So we did get pretty far in the process in the House. And I assume it will be back in some capacity again in front of our committee. But yeah, I have strong opinions about it myself, but wanted to kind of bring that up in the conversation. And I appreciate that. So thank you so much. All right. Sam, hello.
Hello.
You're coming to us from New York?
Correct.
All right.
All right. You all can hear me all right?
Perfectly.
Great. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting us. My name is Samuel Stein. I'm here with my colleague Oksana Mironova. We're from the Community Service Society of New York, which has been around for nearly 180 years, advocating and running programs for low-income New Yorkers. We have been a strong supporter of tenants' rights, but also broader economic security measures. We do a ton of work on healthcare, on legal reform, on transit, on job security, on all sorts of things. But housing has been a core issue throughout all those centuries. New York, like a lot of places, has what you might call a mixed housing market. We have privately owned, owner-occupied homes. We have privately rented, landlord-owned, sometimes occupied, sometimes not housing. We have public housing. We have rent-stabilized housing, approximately half the private rental stock in New York City. We also have rent stabilization in many surrounding counties. We have nonprofit-owned affordable housing. We have a lot of limited equity cooperatives where tenants share ownership of a building and sell for essentially what they bought for to the next owner. Since 2017, we've had right to counsel for low-income New York City residents, and we're working on expanding that beyond the city level, as well as expanding the qualifications for it. We don't have a rental registry in New York. We do have something called the LLC Transparency Act. Limited liability corporations own the vast majority of rental housing in New York. And so we passed a state law that would create a database of who's behind those LLCs so that it was harder to hide behind this legal fiction. We were thinking about things like price fixing and collusion with the RealPage lawsuit and situation. We were thinking about wage theft that sometimes happens in construction sites. And so we passed this law, but unfortunately it was changed at the last minute to be a registry that's essentially only visible to law enforcement. So while that's useful for some aspects of the law, it doesn't help a tenant understand who their landlord is if it's just a anonymous limited liability corporation. So we have a lot more work to be done in terms of transparency in housing in New York. We have a very long history of housing crises. We've had a tight rental market for a very long time in New York City, but we also have looser but severely disinvested rental housing stock in other parts of the state. We also have a long history with policy experimentation. I'll be focusing today on good cause or just cause eviction and related laws, but we're really happy to talk about others in the Q&A if you'd like. A few years ago, 2019, there was a kind of overall change to the rent laws in New York State after really decades of campaigning showing that the laws were incentivizing the worst kind of behavior that we didn't want to incentivize. We clarified a lot of the rules around rent stabilization and other housing issues, including manufactured housing in rural communities. It was a big omnibus package. It was supposed to include good cause eviction protection for people who are not in rent-regulated housing, but that was ultimately not included. So that became something to discuss and debate in the coming years. Finally, in 2024, New York State did pass good cause. Getting back to that question of state versus local, it's kind of an interesting compromise. The state law applied immediately to New York City with defined terms and then allowed localities to opt in after that, and they can set their own terms. Interestingly, the localities that have since opted in have opted for much stronger terms than the ones that were mandated for New York City. So it's sort of growing into a statewide law over time. Currently, 10 municipalities have opted into good cause so far. Catskill and Greene County opted in just last week, so this is very much a live issue. The Community Service Society of New York supported good cause in general for a number of broad reasons. First, as an organization that stands up for low-income people, this is good for tenants. It gives tenants stability, security, and legal protections against displacement, particularly in a tight housing market like New York City, where tenants have the least amount of consumer power to just sort of pick up and go someplace else if they don't like what's happening in their own housing. Too often, tenants prematurely move out or self-evict when they fear displacement, and this will give them more ability to stay. We think it's good for code and law enforcement as well. Good cause can embolden tenants to stand up for their rights. And so under good cause, when tenants experience poor living conditions, discrimination, or other things that are already illegal but have to be enforced by the tenant, they can safely take up these issues with their landlord or file a complaint without fear of retaliatory eviction. We argue that it's good for state and city budgets. It increases the efficiency of housing vouchers, which we have at the city and state level, by making sure that landlords do not raise rents just to capture more subsidy. This has been a problem that's been documented in a few places where housing vouchers are used, but landlords raise the rent knowing that the tenant will still pay the same amount, but the government will pay more. Good cause sort of evens that playing field and makes those subsidy dollars stretch further. Finally, we argued that good cause was good for communities. Good cause eviction stabilizes communities and the rental market. Policy curbs speculation by making it more difficult for large investors to flip residential housing and hike up rents. And so in so doing, it actually made it easier for first-time homeowners to buy housing that would have otherwise been priced out of buying range under the assumption that the rents could go up indefinitely and exponentially, and that tenants could be flipped out very easily. Looking at New York specifically, we passed good cause or supported good cause because there were limits on rent stabilization. As I said before, it covers half the housing stock, half the private housing stock, but it doesn't cover all of it statewide, certainly, and it doesn't cover certain building types, which are becoming an increasingly important part of our housing stock, which is to say smaller buildings. More and more are becoming rentals, and there were no rules about what landlords and tenants could expect. We do have a problem, or had a problem, of no-fault evictions, very often at the point of tenants being run out of neighborhoods as their neighborhoods change, even if they had been in them for a very long time and had been paying the rent and had been otherwise model tenants. They could not stay in their homes in their neighborhoods. We've seen runaway rents and runaway sale prices, pricing out first-time buyers, an uneven landlord playing field that we felt was penalizing the best actors, really, and making it so small landlords and nonprofits couldn't compete with the big actors that were buying up the rental housing stock. The lack of organizing protections made it difficult to do code enforcement, which is almost always tenant initiated. And so all those factors combined to make it a real priority for our organization and for many across the state. We do a survey of households. We used to be just in New York City, and this year we expanded to 7 areas of the entire state of New York. And in this survey, we asked people, whether they support good cause and whether they want it in their locality if they don't have it already. And we found 2/3 of respondents supported across the board. I'm sorry, 3/4 support, and it was across the board with more than 2/3 of people supporting good cause from all income levels, all geographies, urban, suburban, and rural, all races, genders, ages, and party affiliations. So it has very broad support in New York State. 74% of residents in the areas closest to Vermont, North County and the Capital District, said they supported good cause. 74% of homeowners said they supported good cause. So this has now been established and it's rolling out. We've already seen this protect tenants, and we've seen also small landlords saying that this has sort of clarified the rules and even the playing field. I'm going to pass it now to my colleague Oksana, who's going to talk about a study we did looking at New York and New Jersey.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. It's great to be here. My name is Oksana Mironova, and I am also a senior policy analyst at CSS in New York. But I will not be talking about New York. I will be talking about New Jersey. As Sam described, we spent a number of years thinking about and considering the impact of good cause on New York's rental market as the bill was in play in our state house. And during that process, we looked to New Jersey to really understand the way that good cause operates in all sorts of different rental markets, because New Jersey has had good cause on the books on the state level for over 50 years. The state is a strong home rule state, so there is this big framing from the state relating to good cause, but then there are a ton of small municipalities, including villages, townships, and cities all across New Jersey that have a wide variation of different types of tenant protection as well. Tenant protections, housing programs, some of the programs that Trom mentioned in her presentation, including some places that have right to counsel, some places that don't, some places that have really strong rent controls, other places that have fairly weak ones, and many that don't have rent controls at all. So there's kind of a lot of space for research and experimentation. The main takeaways from our research that we found were that the state framework of good cause improved affordability and stability in the state. There were not limits. It didn't impact supply in any way. In fact, over the past 15 years, there has been a pretty explosive development in many urban and suburban parts of the state, including those that have that obviously have good cause because it's a state law, but even those that have very strong rental protections, including rent control. And as the conditions in many of the urban and suburban areas that are adjacent to New York City have changed, the law has had a really important impact in tight rental markets, protecting tenants that would have otherwise been priced out. So like Sam mentioned, in 2022, we at CSS published a report called The Truth About Good Cause and Housing Supply, pretty obviously named, descriptive in its nature, and it looked at the impacts of good cause in New Jersey's housing market. We found that good cause laws leave space for new buildings cost and financing because of initial rent setting. So new construction isn't impacted by good cause, and there's not a market distortion. And we saw that bear on the housing market in many of New Jersey's rural, suburban and urban areas. Cities and states with strong tenant protections continue to build rental housing, some at faster rates compared to those that didn't have good cause. Specifically, New Jersey continuously outpaced New York State in new housing construction relative to its population, while having the law on the books. This trend was especially pronounced since 2010. And even continued throughout the pandemic. And this kind of relates back to the slide that Trump shared about the development patterns all across the US. But that those kind of trends were especially visible in New Jersey, where development really heated up in the 2010s and continued through the pandemic as well. Cities in New Jersey's Hudson County, so this is the county that's adjacent to New York City, including Jersey City and West New York, have both some of the strongest tenant protections in the country and also the fastest rates of housing production. Meanwhile, New Jersey suburbs, so the suburban areas that kind of like fill in the space between Newark, New Jersey, Jersey City, West New York, so kind of like going up the Hudson. Those suburbs added housing at 3 times the rate of New York suburbs that are also adjacent to the city. So there's kind of like the economic pull of the cities that is driving the development in those areas. And those suburbs have good cause. Some of them have rent control as well, and the development is not impacted. The other finding we also looked at, there's been some concern about the shift from the development of rentals to the development of condos and co-ops. And in Jersey, there was no such shift. The production of rental and homeowner housing is essentially the same today, the share between the two, as it was in 1974 when New Jersey enacted its good cause law. In our research, we also found that tenant protections don't lead to abandonment and disinvestment. In our review of existing literature, we came across multiple studies of New Jersey tenant protections because of the legal landscape of the state. There's space for what is essentially a natural experiment where all all New Jersey communities have good cause, so that's the baseline, but there's so much variation in other types of tenant protections. There's a study that looked at a sample of 161 New Jersey communities in 2015, testing the general impact of rent control, both its presence, whether or not like a binary, basically, it doesn't have rent control or not, and also its relative strictness. So looking at the size of the rent cap on housing quality and abandonment. And the study found that strong tenant protections do not result in a decline in conditions or abandonment, even when controlling for things like apartment size, income, median rents, race, and poverty. And the study built on research conducted 15 years earlier, so in 2000. And between 2000 and 2015, the housing market in New Jersey changed drastically. And the results were the same. So it kind of continued to be true no matter what is happening in the housing market, including a rapid increase leading up to the foreclosure crisis, a drop, an increase again after the foreclosure crisis. We also found, again, doing a little bit of a review of literature as we were considering good cause in our state, that good cause protections allow tenants to demand that their landlord fix persistent problems in their homes. And places that don't have good cause, tenants are more reluctant to ask for those changes because of a legitimate fear of landlord retaliation. A study of tenants in Washington, D.C., so leaving New Jersey for a second, found that 61% of respondents were more willing to insist on repairs with strengthened tenant protection laws than they would have been without them. And this relates back to something that Trump said in her presentation, that 52% of Vermont's tenants felt pressure to move in 2024, including a sizable share of tenants that felt the pressure to move because of conditions issues. So good cause creates a little bit of a bulwark where tenants are able to negotiate with their landlords for better conditions. Just cause and other rental protections have proven to be quite popular in New Jersey in recent years, both as a reaction to tightening rental markets and increasing rents, but also, and that relates to the fact that the state faces the same type of rent fixing scandals that have been observed in other parts of the country and prosecuted by the Department of Justice. In recent years, Hoboken reaffirmed its tenant protection laws. This happened just a month ago, and other small municipalities all around the state have passed some of the strongest tenant protections in the country. So there is, this is a state that is very familiar with tenant protections and has people move around. So people live in places for a while that don't have rent control and don't have tenant protections, and they're able to move to places that do have rent control. And it seems like among the population, there is seems to be interest in support for strong tenant protections, and certainly interest and support for the state's 50-year-old good cause law. I will stop there, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you so very much. Committee, any questions coming to mind? Online? Angela, take it away.
I think this is probably a question for maybe both of the speakers, but I'm curious what the average time frame is for an eviction in your jurisdictions, like how long it takes from start to finish on average for a landlord.
So I can answer for Jersey. It varies dramatically place to place. And I don't think there's actually a correlation to there's not a correlation to good cause because the whole state has it, because local jurisdictions have control over the way that they do their local proceedings. There's just, I think, a little bit too much variation to say it's one way or another way, but it does, good cause leave space for the localities to decide what that's going to look like locally, depending on their conditions. So like Newark is going to look different than a suburban county, like on the edge of Philadelphia, for example, like Cherry Hill.
But But just if you have a ballpark, I mean, the things I was finding in my research suggested that it was 3 weeks to 3 months is sort of a window. And I understand different jurisdictions have different timeframes, but was just curious of what the average length of time is in New Jersey.
Yeah, again, it's just there's just too much variation to say an average. It's definitely like not 3 weeks. So a month to 3 months would probably be the ballpark.
All right. Anyone else, committee have any questions for our guests? Going once? All right. Well, thank you so very much for joining us. Again, would love to post all your slides and other things, and please be in touch. You have our committee assistants contact if you need to if you forgot something or wanted to add anything to the conversation. And likewise, we will reach out to you if anything comes to mind. Thank you so very much. Really
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And
everyone.
yeah, if you have any questions for us, please feel free to reach out.
Very grateful for your time. Thank you. All right. Well, will you look at that? I'm really impressed by our time keeping. Very good, very efficient. We have 5 minutes left. So our next meeting is
12/2, December 7th.
Oh my, all right.
2 weeks.
For 2 weeks. All right, so I have collected the feedback from our committee discussion about some things to look into, folks to reach out to. Got to connect with Terry. I really want to have some judiciary perspective in here as soon as possible. So we'll connect with Terry, and again, folks on the committee or folks who are watching this in public. Public comment is a really important part of this process and important personally to me, always. So reach out to your networks and put calls out to have folks come in. It's been really great having members of our community speak out. I have shared that this committee exists with my legislative colleagues. And so encouraging them to also reach out to folks in their communities. This is their chance before we, get our report in and then get to work in what feels like 10 minutes. So thanks everyone, and we will see you in 2 weeks, and reach out to Mike or me if you have folks who would like to